They said nothing survives a fire like that. Not in the middle of the Nevada backcountry, where the wind carries dust like memory and the heat lingers long after the sun has gone down. At 6:42 p.m., the sky was already turning the color of cold steel, stretched thin over a stretch of desert highway where silence felt heavier than sound. A burned-out truck sat just off the gravel shoulder, its frame twisted and blackened, metal still faintly ticking as it cooled under the fading heat of the day. No sirens echoed in the distance anymore, only the soft hiss of wind moving through dry brush and shattered glass scattered like frost across the earth. Somewhere beyond that stillness, Sergeant Ethan Walker stepped out of his military transport, boots pressing into ash-dusted ground, his gaze locked on the wreckage as if it might speak if he stared long enough. Beside him, moving with quiet precision, was Rex, a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 whose coat caught the last light in dull amber tones. His posture already changed the moment they arrived. No bark, no hesitation, only a low, controlled stillness that every handler learns to respect more than any alert signal. Ethan didn't speak at first, because experience had taught him that certain scenes don't need interpretation, they only need attention. The radio clipped to his vest crackled once, a dispatcher's voice confirming what everyone already assumed. No confirmed survivors in the initial sweep, standard protocol for a vehicle fire of this intensity. But Rex didn't respond to protocol. His head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as he moved forward one step at a time, slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter of the burned truck like he was reading something invisible written into the air itself. Ethan followed his movement without rushing him, his eyes scanning the warped frame of the vehicle, the shattered rear panel, the scorched edges of what had once been a cargo compartment. The smell of burned rubber and hot metal still hung faintly in the air, mixed with dry desert dust that stuck to the back of the throat. Something about the scene didn't sit right, not because of what was visible, but because of what wasn't. No obvious movement, no sound of distress, no clear point of entry or exit, just silence layered over silence. Rex suddenly stopped near the rear section of the truck, his body stiffening in a way Ethan had only seen a handful of times in the field. The K9 didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't signal in the usual way. Instead, he pressed his nose close to a warped seam in the metal paneling, then shifted sideways, claws scraping lightly against the ground as he repositioned, as if trying to confirm something from a different angle. Ethan knelt slightly, one hand resting near the tactical light on his vest, watching closely now, because when a dog like Rex changed behavior, it was never random. The desert wind picked up for a moment, brushing through the sagebrush and carrying the faint echo of distant traffic from the highway behind them. But here at the wreckage, everything remained strangely contained, like the world had narrowed to this single point of inspection. Rex moved again, this time faster, circling toward the opposite side of the truck, where the frame dipped slightly under its own collapse. He paused there, head tilted, ears locked forward, eyes fixed on a space that looked no different from any other part of the burned structure. Ethan stepped closer, crouching beside him, his gloved hand brushing against the edge of the scorched metal, feeling heat still buried deep inside it like a lingering pulse. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Rex exhaled sharply through his nose, a subtle shift in posture that made Ethan's attention sharpen instantly. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't hesitation. It was recognition of something hidden just beyond immediate perception. Ethan leaned in slightly, adjusting his angle of view into the darkened interior of the wreck, where shadows folded into each other in unnatural ways. And that was when he noticed it. Not movement, not sound, but structure, a section of the cargo compartment that didn't match the rest of the collapse, too intact, too defined, as if something had shielded it from the full force of the fire. Rex placed one paw forward and held it there, unmoving, as if anchoring himself to certainty. Ethan's voice came low, almost instinctively calm, steady in the way trained Marines speak when uncertainty begins to take shape, and in that moment, the stillness around them felt less like emptiness and more like waiting. The air around the burned vehicle felt heavier the longer Ethan Walker stayed still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Rex had not moved from his position near the warped rear panel, his body locked in a posture that every trained handler recognizes as absolute focus. There was no aggression in him, no panic, only a deep, unwavering certainty that something beneath the surface of this wreck was not what it appeared to be. Ethan slowly shifted his weight, lowering himself closer to the line of sight Rex seemed to be following, his eyes tracing the same distorted angles of blackened metal and collapsed framing. At first, it all looked like uniform destruction, the kind left behind when heat and time work together to erase structure. But then he noticed a subtle irregularity, a section where the outer shell had caved in differently, forming a narrow cavity that had somehow resisted full collapse. The opening was not visible from a distance, hidden behind layers of scorched debris and twisted framing, but Rex was already oriented toward it, his nose hovering just inches from the gap, breathing slow and controlled. Ethan raised a gloved hand slightly, signaling for calm even though no one else was speaking, his voice low and steady as he spoke more to himself than to anyone else, acknowledging the possibility that something inside this structure had remained untouched enough to matter. The desert wind shifted again, carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with ash, and in that moment Rex gave a subtle change in posture, a slight forward lean, as if confirming a presence rather than discovering one. Ethan adjusted his angle and carefully moved closer to the rear section, placing one hand against the edge of the frame, feeling the residual heat still trapped inside the metal. It was then that he noticed a faint sound, almost indistinguishable from the wind itself, not a call for help, not a cry, but a rhythmic irregularity, like something alive, struggling to maintain steady breathing within a confined space. His attention sharpened instantly, and he motioned toward the tactical flashlight attached to his vest, switching it on and directing a controlled beam into the narrow opening. What the light revealed was not the obvious interior of a destroyed vehicle, but a secondary compartment partially shielded by a reinforced partition, its structure warped but not fully breached. Rex immediately shifted closer, pressing his nose toward the opening, his entire body still and focused in a way that removed all doubt from Ethan's mind that this was not random behavior. Ethan spoke softly into his radio, requesting a secondary assessment team, but his eyes never left the gap in the metal. The silence around them felt different now, no longer empty but suspended, as if the entire scene had narrowed to this single hidden space. He carefully widened his view, adjusting the angle of the light, and that was when he saw movement, faint, subtle, but unmistakably deliberate, a small shift within the darkness that suggested presence rather than absence. Ethan's breath slowed as he processed what he was seeing, because what should have been an empty compartment was instead showing signs of life that had endured against expectation. Rex let out a low, controlled exhale, not a bark or warning, but something closer to confirmation, as if the truth had finally aligned with what he had sensed all along. Ethan steadied himself, placing both hands near the edge of the opening, carefully testing the stability of the structure before committing further, his training guiding every movement with precision and caution. The interior space beyond the gap was tight, compressed, designed for storage rather than occupancy, yet within it there was unmistakable evidence of someone having taken shelter there. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he adjusted the flashlight beam again, revealing a partial outline, not fully visible yet, but clearly human in form, positioned low and protected by the remaining structure of the vehicle. For a brief moment, everything outside that space seemed to fade, the desert, the wind, even Rex's presence, becoming secondary to the realization forming in Ethan's mind. He leaned closer, voice calm but firm as he attempted verbal contact, carefully choosing words meant to reassure rather than alarm, while Rex remained motionless beside him, as if guarding the fragile moment itself. Inside the confined space, there was another slight movement, more defined this time, confirming that whatever was within was not only present but conscious enough to respond. Ethan paused, his hand hovering near the edge of the opening, understanding fully that whatever came next would require careful extraction and absolute control, because survival in conditions like this was not only about endurance, but about the thin margin between awareness and collapse. And in that suspended silence, both man and K9 held steady, waiting for the moment when hidden truth would finally step into the light. The moment stretched inside the burned wreckage like a held breath refusing to release. Ethan Walker remained steady at the edge of the narrow opening, his flashlight fixed on the dim interior where movement had just been confirmed. Rex stood beside him without shifting his stance, ears forward, eyes locked with the same unwavering focus, as if he were holding the entire situation in place through presence alone. Inside the confined space, the faint movement appeared again, more deliberate this time, a subtle shift that confirmed not just survival but awareness. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, careful not to disturb the fragile structure of twisted metal and partially collapsed framing, his training guiding every motion with deliberate patience. The air around the opening felt warmer, not from fire, but from the trapped heat that still lingered deep within the insulated compartment, creating an unnatural contrast with the cool desert wind outside. He spoke again in a calm, controlled voice, identifying himself clearly and slowly, offering reassurance rather than urgency, because panic had no place in moments like this. Rex leaned forward just slightly, not crossing the threshold, but close enough that his presence could be felt inside the confined space, as if communicating without sound. "Hey!" Faint response followed, not verbal, but physical, a slight shift deeper within the compartment that suggested the occupant was conscious enough to register external contact. Ethan carefully widened the beam of his flashlight, revealing more of the interior structure, and what had once seemed like a simple cargo compartment now showed signs of intentional reinforcement, as if someone had been trapped inside a space never meant to be accessed from the outside. The realization settled in slowly, that this was not merely an accident scene but a situation where survival had depended on deliberate positioning and endurance. Ethan's eyes tracked along the edges of the compartment, noting the way debris had formed a partial shield, creating a pocket of space insulated from the most extreme effects of the fire. Rex let out a low, steady breath, not a sound of excitement, but recognition, as if confirming what he had sensed from the very beginning. Inside, the movement became slightly more defined, and Ethan carefully adjusted his angle again, revealing the faint outline of a human figure positioned low against the far side of the compartment, partially obscured but undeniably present. The figure did not move quickly, but there was enough motion to confirm consciousness, a subtle shift of posture that suggested awareness returning in waves rather than certainty. Ethan paused, allowing the moment to stabilize, knowing that sudden action could destabilize both the structure and the fragile condition of whoever was inside. He spoke again, slower this time, using clear and steady phrasing designed to orient rather than alarm, maintaining a tone that remained calm even under uncertainty. Rex remained perfectly still, his body aligned with the opening, as if forming a silent boundary between chaos outside and fragile survival within. The desert wind passed over them again, carrying distant heat and dust, but in this small space of discovery, everything felt isolated, as if the world had narrowed to this single point of truth. Ethan shifted his flashlight slightly downward, revealing more detail, enough to confirm that the individual had remained protected within the compartment, long enough to endure conditions that would have otherwise been overwhelming. The realization carried a weight that settled quietly in Ethan's expression, not shock, not relief, but a focused awareness that time was now the most critical factor. He adjusted his stance, preparing for controlled access, while maintaining constant visual contact with the movement inside, ensuring no sudden change would go unnoticed. Rex finally lowered his head slightly, not in retreat, but in a posture of steady vigilance, as if acknowledging that the presence inside was no longer hidden, but found. And in that suspended silence, the line between uncertainty and survival had finally begun to take shape. The silence that followed felt heavier than the heat still trapped inside the wreckage, as Ethan Walker carefully adjusted his position at the narrow opening, maintaining steady control over both his breathing and his focus. Rex remained beside him, unwavering, his body angled toward the same point of concentration, as if both man and K9 were synchronized by something deeper than instruction. Inside the confined compartment, the faint movement continued, now more consistent, confirming that consciousness was present and stable enough to respond to external presence. Ethan slowly lowered the intensity of his flashlight beam to avoid overwhelming the space, choosing instead to let the light settle softly along the edges of the interior where structure and shadow met. The outline he had seen earlier became more defined as his eyes adjusted, revealing the form of a man positioned low and partially braced against the far side of the compartment, his posture suggesting endurance rather than collapse. There was no visible panic, only the subtle signs of fatigue that come from prolonged confinement and heat exposure, and Ethan recognized immediately that urgency needed to be balanced with precision. He spoke again in a calm and steady tone, identifying himself clearly and offering reassurance in simple, grounded language meant to orient rather than overwhelm, because in situations like this clarity mattered more than speed. Rex shifted slightly, not forward but closer to Ethan's side, maintaining a protective alignment with the opening as if ensuring that nothing would interfere with what came next. The desert wind outside moved gently across the burned truck, carrying faint traces of ash and cooling metal, while inside the compartment the air remained still, dense, and warm from trapped energy. Ethan carefully reached toward the edge of the warped frame, testing its stability with controlled pressure, confirming that the structure would hold long enough for a careful extraction rather than a forced entry. The interior occupant shifted again, a small but deliberate movement that confirmed awareness had improved, and Ethan responded by slowing his actions even further, knowing that sudden motion could disrupt both physical stability and the fragile recovery of consciousness. He adjusted his angle once more, widening the field of view just enough to ensure there were no hidden obstructions or secondary hazards within the compartment. What he saw now confirmed what Rex had indicated from the beginning, that this space had functioned as a partial shelter, not by design, but by circumstance, shielding its occupant from the most severe impact of the fire and allowing survival where logic would have suggested otherwise. Ethan paused for a moment, letting the reality of that settle without interruption, then reached for his communication device to request immediate medical support at the location, keeping his voice measured and professional. Rex remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the occupant, his presence steady and grounding, as if reinforcing the boundary between survival and uncertainty. Inside the compartment, the man shifted again, this time slightly more upright, revealing a clearer outline of his condition, conscious and responsive enough to register light and sound. Ethan immediately softened his voice further, offering reassurance once more, maintaining a rhythm of calm communication designed to stabilize rather than stimulate. He then carefully began preparing for access, scanning the edges of the compartment for the safest possible point of entry, ensuring that no structural shift would compromise the space. The burned frame around them creaked faintly as temperature differences continued to settle, but Ethan remained still long enough to assess every angle before committing to movement. Rex lowered his head slightly, not in withdrawal but in quiet acknowledgement of the moment's gravity, his training evident in the way he remained disciplined and controlled. Ethan finally selected a reinforced section near the lower edge of the compartment, judging it to be the least unstable point, and placed his hands carefully against it, applying gradual pressure to test resistance. The structure held, but only just, confirming that any further action would need to be slow, deliberate, and continuous. Inside, the occupant responded to the subtle vibration, shifting slightly closer to the opening, as if recognizing the approach of assistance. Ethan immediately paused again, ensuring the movement had not caused distress, then continued speaking in a calm, steady cadence designed to maintain orientation. Rex stepped half a pace closer, still not entering the space, but aligning himself directly with Ethan's position as if forming a coordinated support system. The desert around them remained unchanged, vast and quiet, but within this single fractured space, every second carried weight and precision. Ethan inhaled slowly, then exhaled with control, preparing for the final phase of access, fully aware that what lay inside this burned structure was no longer a mystery, but a life sustained through improbability and silence. The moment Ethan Walker made his decision, the entire scene narrowed into a controlled sequence of precision and timing, as if the burned wreckage itself had become a fragile system waiting to be opened correctly rather than forced. He kept one hand steady against the reinforced edge of the compartment while the other shifted slightly to test the resistance of the warped metal, ensuring that no sudden movement would compromise the fragile structure holding everything together. Rex remained exactly where he was, aligned with Ethan's position, his posture calm but alert, eyes locked into the narrow opening, as if maintaining a silent connection with what lay inside. The desert wind passed behind them in slow waves, carrying heat from the open highway and faint traces of ash that clung to the edges of the vehicle like memory. Inside the compartment, the occupant shifted again, a subtle movement that confirmed awareness was increasing, and Ethan immediately adjusted his posture to reduce pressure and avoid any unnecessary vibration through the structure. He lowered his voice further, speaking in a steady rhythm meant to reassure and orient, carefully avoiding any abrupt tone that could cause confusion or stress. Rex gave a quiet shift of weight, leaning slightly closer but still respecting the boundary of the opening, his presence acting as a stabilizing force in the space between action and restraint. Ethan carefully examined the edge of the panel again, identifying a point where the metal had weakened but not fully collapsed, a potential access route that could be widened without destabilizing the surrounding frame. He signaled for additional support through his communication device, requesting immediate medical response and structural caution, his tone controlled and professional even as the urgency of the situation increased beneath the surface. Inside the compartment, the silhouette of the man became clearer as the shifting angle of light revealed more detail, showing that he was conscious, breathing steadily, and positioned in a way that suggested he had intentionally protected himself within this confined space during the incident. Ethan paused for a brief moment, allowing his eyes to adjust again, confirming that there were no secondary hazards or hidden obstructions that could interfere with extraction. The silence around them felt different now, no longer empty but focused, as if the entire environment had compressed into this single point of survival. Rex remained motionless, his gaze unwavering, his body language reflecting absolute certainty that what they had found was not only real, but stable enough to be reached. Ethan placed both hands carefully against the weakened section of the structure, applying gradual and evenly distributed pressure to test how much resistance remained, ensuring that every movement was deliberate and controlled. The metal responded with a faint shift, not a collapse, but a slight release of tension, indicating that the panel could be carefully worked open if handled correctly. Inside, the occupant reacted subtly to the change, shifting closer toward the faint opening of light, as if instinctively responding to the possibility of assistance. Ethan immediately stopped all motion for a moment, allowing the structure to settle and ensuring the movement had not created instability. He continued speaking in a calm, steady tone, maintaining communication as a grounding point for the person inside, reinforcing awareness without increasing stress. Rex lowered his head slightly, maintaining his position beside Ethan, his presence steady and unwavering, as if reinforcing the shared understanding that this moment required patience above all else. The desert beyond remained unchanged, vast and quiet, but here at the burned vehicle, every second carried precision and weight, every action measured against the possibility of both success and collapse. Ethan exhaled slowly, focusing fully on the next controlled movement, preparing to widen the access point just enough to safely confirm the condition inside before proceeding further, knowing that what came next would determine whether survival remained possible or slipped back into uncertainty. The controlled stillness around the burned wreckage tightened further as Ethan Walker maintained his position at the weakened edge of the compartment, carefully balancing pressure and patience in equal measure. The structure responded in subtle shifts under his hands, metal that had been pushed beyond its original design, now holding together through tension rather than strength. Rex remained fixed beside him, his stance unchanged, eyes locked into the narrow opening where the faint presence inside continued to show signs of awareness. The desert air moved slowly across the open highway, carrying heat that rose from the sand and mixed with the cooling frame of the vehicle, creating a layered temperature that felt almost unreal against the precision of the moment unfolding. Inside the compartment, the occupant shifted again, this time with slightly more intention, as if responding not only to sound and light, but to the growing certainty that help was no longer distant. Ethan lowered his voice further, speaking in steady and deliberate phrases meant to maintain orientation, ensuring that the human presence inside remained calm and aware of external contact. Rex adjusted his head angle slightly, not stepping forward, but refining his position in relation to the opening, his behavior reflecting a deep internal synchronization with Ethan's actions. Ethan carefully applied a measured increase of pressure to the weakened section of the panel, testing the threshold of resistance without crossing into instability, and the metal responded with a faint but meaningful shift, indicating that a controlled widening was possible. He paused immediately, allowing the structure to settle again, his training reinforcing the importance of timing over force in environments where every movement carries consequence. Inside, the silhouette became clearer as the angle of light shifted through the widening gap, revealing more defined contours of a man who had endured within that confined space far longer than expected. Ethan's focus sharpened as he observed breathing patterns that, while irregular, remained stable enough to confirm survival under extreme conditions. He signaled again through his communication device, requesting immediate medical support to be positioned at the site entry point, his voice steady but increasingly firm as situational urgency increased. Rex remained completely still, his presence acting as a constant anchor in the space between action and restraint, his attention unwavering, as if confirming each subtle change before it was fully visible. The desert wind passed again across the wreckage, momentarily disturbing ash along the ground. But inside the compartment, everything remained insulated, compressed, and focused entirely on the fragile life contained within. Ethan adjusted his grip once more, then carefully shifted the angle of pressure along the weakened seam, and this time the structure responded with a slightly larger release, not breaking but yielding just enough to allow a clearer view inside. The occupant reacted immediately to the change in light and space, moving slightly closer toward the opening, confirming awareness and intent to respond. Ethan paused again, ensuring stability, then continued speaking in a calm and steady cadence, reinforcing presence without introducing urgency that could disrupt the moment. Rex lowered his head marginally, maintaining alignment with Ethan's position, his body language reflecting disciplined control and deep attentiveness to the unfolding situation. Ethan's eyes tracked every micro-movement within the compartment, confirming that the individual inside was not only alive but actively adjusting to external contact, a critical sign in sustained confinement scenarios. He carefully evaluated the remaining structural integrity, identifying the safest continuation point for gradual access while maintaining full control of load distribution. The metal creaked faintly under controlled tension, but held, confirming that a slow and precise opening remained viable. Inside, the man shifted again, now closer to the opening than before, as if drawn toward the presence of help that had finally reached him through layers of heat, metal, and silence. Ethan held steady, preparing for the next controlled phase of extraction, fully aware that every additional inch of movement brought both clarity and risk into sharper balance. The moment stretched into a controlled silence as Ethan Walker maintained steady pressure against the weakened seam of the burned vehicle, carefully balancing every movement with precision that came from years of disciplined field experience. The structure responded in small, measured shifts, metal that had once been rigid now softened by heat and time, holding its shape only through tension and partial collapse. Rex stood beside him without deviation, his posture unchanged, eyes locked into the narrowing opening, as if maintaining a constant read on what lay beyond visible certainty. Inside the compartment, the occupant shifted again, this time with more clarity and intent, confirming not only awareness but a growing response to external presence. Ethan kept his voice steady and low, continuing to speak in calm, structured phrases meant to orient and reassure, ensuring that the human presence inside remained grounded despite confinement and stress. The desert air moved slowly across the scene, carrying faint heat from the asphalt and cooling remnants of metal, creating a subtle contrast that emphasized how isolated this moment had become. Ethan adjusted his grip slightly, then paused again, allowing the structure to settle before applying any additional force, fully aware that stability was now the defining factor between access and collapse. Rex shifted his weight by a fraction, aligning himself more closely with Ethan's position, not stepping forward but reinforcing presence in a way that mirrored understanding rather than command. Inside, The silhouette of the man became clearer as the angle of light improved, revealing a posture that indicated controlled endurance rather than collapse, suggesting that the occupant had actively adapted to survive within the confined space. Ethan observed carefully, noting the rhythm of breathing and subtle movements that confirmed sustained consciousness, his focus narrowing further as he assessed both physical condition and environmental risk. He activated his communication device once more, requesting immediate medical readiness at the extraction point, his tone calm, but increasingly firm as operational urgency rose beneath procedural control. The wind passed over the wreckage again, briefly shifting ash along the ground, but the interior space remained insulated, almost sealed in its own environment of heat and stillness. Ethan carefully shifted his angle of approach, applying gradual and evenly distributed pressure along the reinforced edge, and the structure responded with another slight release, not breaking but yielding just enough to expand visibility. He immediately stopped again, allowing the frame to stabilize, ensuring that no unintended shift would compromise the fragile balance of forces holding the compartment intact. Inside, the occupant moved closer toward the opening, now clearly oriented toward the source of light and sound, confirming responsiveness that indicated improving awareness. Ethan maintained steady communication, continuing his calm verbal guidance, reinforcing orientation without introducing urgency or disruption, knowing that stabilization was as critical as physical extraction. Rex lowered his head slightly, maintaining unwavering focus, his presence acting as a constant stabilizing force between external chaos and internal fragility. Ethan's eyes tracked every subtle change within the compartment, confirming that the man inside was not only conscious but actively engaging with the external environment, a critical indicator that recovery remained possible. He carefully assessed the remaining structural integrity, identifying the safest continuation point for controlled access, ensuring that every movement would preserve both safety and stability. The metal around the seam creaked faintly under controlled tension, but held firm enough to allow continued gradual progression. Inside, the occupant shifted again, now positioned closer than before, responding directly to the presence of assistance that had finally reached through layers of heat, metal, and silence. Ethan held steady, fully focused, preparing for the next precise adjustment that would transition observation into full access, knowing that the difference between uncertainty and survival now rested on the smallest measured movement. The burned wreckage stood motionless in the fading desert light, as Ethan Walker maintained his position at the widened seam of the compartment, carefully controlling every movement with the precision of a trained Marine who understood that stability mattered more than speed. The metal had been gradually coaxed into a narrow but usable opening, just enough to confirm presence and prepare for controlled access without compromising the structure. Rex remained anchored beside him, unwavering and silent, his eyes fixed on the opening with a level of focus that mirrored Ethan's own disciplined attention. Inside the compartment, the occupant had moved closer, now positioned within clearer range of visibility, his form no longer obscured by shadow alone, but defined enough to confirm sustained consciousness and deliberate response. Ethan lowered his voice, further, continuing calm and steady verbal communication, ensuring the man inside remained oriented and aware of external support, his tone consistent and measured without urgency or disruption. The desert wind shifted once again across the open highway, carrying faint heat and dust, but within the wreckage the air remained still and insulated, holding onto the last traces of energy trapped inside the metal frame. Ethan carefully adjusted his hands along the edge of the structure, applying gradual and evenly distributed pressure to expand the opening by a fraction, and the metal responded with a controlled release rather than collapse, confirming that the integrity of the compartment still held under careful manipulation. He paused immediately, allowing the structure to settle again, fully aware that every adjustment required patience and absolute control. Rex subtly repositioned his stance, aligning himself more directly with Ethan's angle of access, maintaining a silent but constant presence that reinforced the balance between action and restraint. Inside, the man shifted again, this time more clearly visible, his posture confirming both awareness and responsiveness to the increasing light and sound entering the compartment. Ethan observed carefully, noting the rhythm of breathing and the subtle coordination of movement that indicated the occupant was actively orienting himself rather than remaining passive. He activated his communication device once more, confirming that medical support was now within approach range, his voice steady and professional despite the growing urgency of the situation. The surrounding environment remained unchanged, vast and silent beyond the immediate focus of the wreckage. But here every detail carried heightened significance, every movement measured against the stability of both structure and survival. Ethan widened the opening by another controlled increment, ensuring that no sudden shift would compromise the surrounding frame, and the metal responded with another faint adjustment, holding but yielding just enough to improve access. Inside, the occupant responded immediately to the change, shifting closer toward the opening, confirming a clear recognition of assistance and direction. Ethan maintained steady verbal guidance, reinforcing orientation through calm instruction, ensuring that the man inside remained grounded as extraction preparation continued. Rex lowered his head slightly, maintaining unwavering attention, his presence steady and composed, reflecting a level of discipline that mirrored the controlled precision of the operation unfolding beside him. Ethan's focus remained absolute as he assessed the final structural points, identifying the safest sequence for full access while maintaining full stability of the surrounding frame. The interior space now revealed enough detail to confirm that the occupant had endured within a protected pocket formed by collapsed but intact reinforcement, a rare structural anomaly that had preserved life where conditions suggested otherwise. Ethan held position for a brief moment, ensuring that all variables remained stable, then carefully prepared for the transition from observation to entry, fully aware that the final phase would require the highest level of control and coordination. Inside, the man remained steady, oriented toward the opening, responding to light and presence, as the boundary between separation and rescue finally reached its most critical threshold. The final moment of controlled transition arrived as Ethan Walker held his position at the widened seam of the burned vehicle, every movement now measured against the fragile stability of both structure and life. The compartment had been carefully opened just enough to allow controlled access, revealing the occupant clearly enough for direct assistance while still maintaining structural integrity. Rex stood beside him in absolute stillness, his focus unwavering, his presence forming a silent but constant anchor beside Ethan as the final phase of extraction began. Inside the compartment, the man had shifted into full visibility, positioned within the narrow protective space that had sustained him through the aftermath of the fire, his condition stable enough to respond, but still requiring immediate support. Ethan lowered his voice once more, offering calm and steady reassurance, maintaining orientation and grounding through simple, clear communication as he prepared to initiate physical assistance. The desert air around them remained unchanged, stretching endlessly across the Nevada highway. But within this moment, everything had narrowed into precision, timing, and care. Ethan carefully adjusted his grip along the reinforced edge, confirming once again that the structure would hold under controlled pressure, then signaled for the final coordinated response from incoming medical support. Rex subtly shifted closer, aligning himself directly with Ethan's movement, maintaining a disciplined posture that reflected complete understanding of the gravity of the situation unfolding beside him. Inside, the occupant responded with a slight forward movement, acknowledging presence and readiness for extraction, his awareness now fully engaged with the external environment. Ethan paused for a brief moment, allowing every variable to stabilize, then initiated the final controlled widening of the opening, applying gradual and evenly distributed force that allowed the metal to yield without collapse. The structure responded with a measured release, enough to create a safe passage point while maintaining the integrity of the surrounding frame. Ethan immediately adjusted his stance, ensuring that no sudden shift would compromise the space, then carefully reached toward the occupant, maintaining constant verbal reassurance throughout the process. Rex remained motionless but fully attentive, his eyes tracking every micro-movement, his presence steady and aligned with the controlled precision of the extraction. The occupant moved closer, guided by Ethan's voice and the expanding light, transitioning from confined space to access point with careful coordination and stability. Ethan secured a stable hold, ensuring safe transfer from the compartment while maintaining full structural awareness, his movements deliberate and controlled, reflecting years of training under pressure. As the extraction completed, the man was brought into the open space beside the wreckage, where the desert air met him gently, contrasting the heat still lingering within. The burned frame. Ethan immediately shifted focus to assessment, maintaining calm verbal contact, ensuring orientation and stability while awaiting medical arrival. Rex stepped forward slightly, then stopped, lowering his head in a quiet and steady posture, remaining close but not intrusive, as if acknowledging the completion of a critical threshold. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain but resolved, filled with the weight of survival achieved through precision, patience, and trust between human and K9. Ethan held position for a moment longer, watching the man stabilize in the open air, confirming that life had been preserved through conditions that once seemed impossible, before finally easing his stance as the next phase of care began to arrive on the horizon.